For now, I want to talk more about the Murdaugh trial here. A lot has been said about Murdaugh's behavior during the trial. Dr. Carole LIeberman, a body language expert, joins us now to talk a little bit more about that. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us this morning. We appreciate it. So first off, just kind of explain to me here, I'm sure you've been paying very close attention to this trial and to the body language. What are your initial thoughts on how everything has played out and the way that Murdaugh has acted, not just while testifying, but really while he's sitting there in the courtroom as well?
Well, I think one of the most interesting parts in terms of watching his body language was the verdict. When the verdict was read, it seemed clear that he knew that it was probably not going to be a good verdict, because the jury took such a short time to decide upon it, and usually that's not good. And he was very stoic, and probably his attorneys had told him, "Don't worry, we're going to appeal it," something like that. But he hardly moved. You could tell he was just holding himself rigid. To not show any emotion. And earlier in the trial, there were times when he, seemed to cry. Certainly, his nose seemed to be dripping, and so on. And some of the time, in fact, it seemed like he was purposely doing certain body movements for the effect on the jury and the effect on people who were watching.
Do you think because he was an attorney, he has knowledge of the fact that people are paying attention to his body language, that he was possibly acting a little different as a result of that?
Yes. He was very aware of the jury watching him, not just listening to him. What's interesting is the jurors, one of the jurors, at least one, has spoken, and he said that the thing that did him in was the camera, the video that his son took, showing that he was at the scene when he had been trying to say, lying and so on, that he wasn't. But, I'm so glad. I was very pleased with the verdict. It would have been very upsetting after 6 weeks if the jury didn't realize that he was such a liar. In fact, he actually is a spoiled brat who never grew up. His family was very wealthy and very prominent and so on. And he just lived a charmed life when he was growing up. And then he used that, all his life. It was just all about me. They were saying, how could he have killed his wife and his son? And he loved them to some degree, but he loved himself more.
That's an interesting way to look at it. We've heard several different people who have said kind of that same thing. So any witnesses during the trial where you observed their body language specifically and it kind of stuck out to you?
Well, I was watching his son, Buster, and there was a time when he put his hand, when Alex Murdaugh was testifying, and he put his hand over his face, and it was to hide his eyes. He didn't want to see the train wreck that his father was on the stand. His father really was a train wreck. He didn't answer the questions. He kept skirting around and not answering the questions about how he felt or what he was thinking when he had to face his clients eye to eye and knew that he was stealing from them. And he wouldn't say, he didn't feel any remorse, and he was avoiding answering that because it was not a good answer. And his son was just like, putting his hand over his face like, oh my God, first of all, this is sealing his guilt. And then another thing, while he was testifying, Alex, there was one time, perhaps you saw this, when he said something about that he loved his wife and his son, and he kind of left out Buster. And then he said, yes, of course, Buster, something like that. And I think that really hurt Buster as well.
Yeah, I totally missed that. So I appreciate you calling that out, because I didn't see that, but it makes a lot of sense there. Do you think that the jury picks up on behaviors and really body language when they are watching someone on the stand or sitting in the courtroom?
Yes. Now, they're not necessarily thinking about it in academic terms, but it resonates with them. They absorb it, and it's just from their experience, their life experience, they intuitively know what these kinds of things mean.
If you could advise a juror on what to look at when it does come to behaviors and body languages, not just for the person who's on trial, but for witnesses specifically, what exactly would you advise them to look at and why?
Well, any kind of, first of all, if they're making movements that seem like they're very nervous, like Alex, for example, kept his typical movement. He looked a lot of the times like he was chewing gum, but, most likely he wasn't chewing gum. They don't usually let people, witnesses and so on, chew gum in the courtroom, even people in the gallery. But he was chewing the insides of his mouth, and that was an anxiety reaction. So other kinds of things, moving your hands in a certain way, twitching, all these sort of twitches, movements that indicate anxiety. That's sort of a generic thing to look for, because if you're telling the truth and you're authentic, you're not making any kinds of nervous sorts of movements. Also not looking people in the eye. And I think Alex did sometimes, he did look the jury in the eye, or so it seemed, from the angle that we were seeing. And that, but he was doing that. And he's been all his life, he's been skilled at pulling the wool over people's eyes. And, in his use of opioids, for example, drug addicts are very skilled at lying and pulling the wool over people's eyes. That's just what they do in order to keep their addiction going and not to be found out. And so that's what he was doing towards the jury, his charm. But the jury wasn't buying it. I mean, they saw through it, thank goodness. And it's interesting too, because I work as a forensic psychiatrist and expert witness, and so I'm looking at all these things from that viewpoint. And what was interesting was, after he testified for those 2 days, and it was a train wreck, his lawyers seemed to be less passionate, less involved, less hopeful that this was going to turn out well. And they had told him not to testify. And sometimes, lawyers often tell the defendant that, and sometimes defendants are just so egotistical or so sure of how, they can fool the jury and so on, that they do it anyway. And you see here, this is a great example of how that's not usually a good thing to do.
Do you think that people who aren't experts like yourself can actually pick up on body language, behavior, things of that nature? Is that something that they can see for themselves, or do you kind of have to be an expert who knows what they're looking for?
I think that the average juror wouldn't necessarily know that this movement means that and this means that. But they do get a general sense, like I was giving the examples of movements that show anxiety or not really, for example, when Alex was being cross-examined, he really didn't face the prosecutor he was kind of at an angle, or at least that's the way it looked on camera. He wasn't, and he never did really answer the prosecutor's questions. So that kind of thing, it's very subtle. So what I'm trying to say is that it's not that they're saying, well, this means this and this means that. He looked this way, he looked that way, he tilted his head down, but it's just something that they have understood from other kinds of interactions that they have had throughout their life. If someone was lying to them, or having certain body movements connected to certain things, they pick up on these things. Some of the jurors more than others.
All right, Dr. Carole LIeberman, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here. Anything you want to add about all of this before I let you go?
Well, besides being very happy that after 6 weeks, that they finally came to a good verdict. Sometimes it's been gotten harder these days to, and sometimes jurors have been influenced by things other than what goes on in the courtroom. And it was really very satisfying to see that these jurors just took their job seriously. It was kind of very cut and dry and very, like the prosecutors were saying, rely on your own common sense. And you got the feeling that this jury did that they were relying on their own common sense, and they saw what was going on and they returned that verdict.
All right, Doctor, thank you so much for joining us today. Obviously, we're going to be watching during that sentencing here at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time, not just to see what happens, but also to watch, his reaction as well. Again, thanks for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you.